This panel is the big picture, the federal-state dynamic in elections. This would have been a very short panel several years ago. I don't know if we've got enough time to fill all of the dynamics of the federal and state dynamic right now. We are very fortunate to have such a great panel here, four excellent election officials and good friends, moderated by the great Miles Parks of National Public Radio, whose voice you all hear talking about these issues in the morning. And starting from Miles' immediate left, Secretary Stephanie Thomas from Connecticut, Secretary Gregg Amore from Rhode Island, Secretary Steve Simon from Minnesota, and former Deputy Secretary of the state of Georgia, Jordan Fuchs. So Miles, I'll hand it off to you. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. And thanks to CEIR for having us and for putting on this panel. I'm really excited to hear all your thoughts. I do want to start just big picture with the climate, because we've been talking for years about the toll that 2020 and the after effects was going to take on election officials. We're now 6 years from 2020. I would like to hear about how you all are doing and how your local election officials are doing, considering how many years of this we've now all gone through. Secretary Simon, why don't you start?
Well, it's still tense. To some extent, we haven't yet rid ourselves of the ghosts of the 2020 election. It still recurs, and we've seen that in actions by the federal government. The raiding of the Fulton County, Georgia Elections Office, not to steal the thunder of my colleague from Georgia here. But, speaking only for myself, here we are 133 days away from the election. Not that we're obsessively counting or anything, but, and for reasons related to 2020, but for other reasons, I think the atmosphere is tense. I mean, I'm an optimist about the ultimate procedural outcomes here, but there's no question. There's tension that pertains exactly to the topic of this panel, which is our relationship, our fraught relationship with the federal government, not just the Department of Homeland Security, but the Justice Department and others as well. So overall, I'd say it can be uneasy and tense, but there's also a sense of resolve that we're not going to let that get in our way.
What about from your locals? Secretary Thomas, I guess, how are you hearing from counties in terms of just the climate and leading up to this election, how people are feeling?
Not for the first time. I will shock people. We have no county form of
government. I forgot. I knew that.
But I know, but our locals at the municipal level, I've only been secretary since 2023, but I will tell you this. When I was in the legislature and after I took office, the locals felt like 2020 was a real hardship, but that everyone came together to make it work. And I have heard many locals say they thought that was the worst thing. And now they feel that this is the worst thing. They did not feel unsafe at that time in the way that they do now. They felt supported at that time, which is very different than they feel now. So I do think that it is all taking a toll. In Connecticut, we've had about 40% turnover, people retiring over the last year and a half, just because the environment is so tough.
David ticked through a lot of the changes that we've seen at the federal level, at DHS and CISA, at DOJ, even at USPS. I guess I'm also curious, Secretary Amore, just what are you expecting from the federal government this midterm cycle?
I think we have come to the point where we're not expecting support. So we're taking on the role that the federal government once took on in supporting us with cybersecurity efforts and other efforts. But I do want to say this, just to piggyback on what Stephanie was saying. I've been really impressed with the resolve of our elections officials and administrators in Rhode Island. The atmosphere is not good, it's tense. But I think our folks have really embraced the idea that they are serving the democracy. And we're a small state, so we're able to support them in ways that I think is more difficult in states that are larger or have many county elections apparatus. So we're not expecting much from the federal government, so we're trying to fill that gap. Now that takes a toll on our resources and time, but I think that's also helped us become closer to our local elections officials, work with them in concert, and really work hard to make sure we're prepared.
I want to focus on Georgia for a second because you are a panelist who comes from the most traditional sort of presidential battleground state. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on or advice as somebody who's been through the ringer from a scrutiny perspective for counties who might be facing this for the first time, who aren't in your Arizonas, your Michigans, your Georgias. If you have any thoughts or takeaways on what people can expect if the spotlight is on them.
I do, and I think this panel can get very depressing very quick. I gotta say, I took a year to go run a campaign, and I came back as of about a week ago. So I'm back into my role that I was in previously as the Deputy Secretary of State. And I started talking to election officials again, re-engaging with the media. And what I found is a lot of people are really nervous. And they're breathlessly talking about, Georgia won't be able to use its voting machines, and the count won't go on, and all these big controversies. And the reality is I think people are overthinking it. I think a lot of the issues are probably overstated. And I'm incredibly hopeful for the future, mainly because I know that the state doesn't run the elections, counties run elections, and they're decentralized for a reason. And it's so that one person can't go in and control the whole system, right? So when we talk about the federal government and its roles in elections related to the states, my life largely hasn't changed since Trump first term, Biden, and that now Trump second term. The relationship has been pretty much similar throughout, my time at SOS. And the state is largely independent from the federal government, as I believe as a Christian conservative, it should be. I believe in states' rights at the end of the day. So in terms of this election, I think that we're more prepared than ever. I think there's an emphasis on focusing on the past, and a lot of those things are overstated. I think we're more than prepared to run a great election. And sure, there are some bad actors, but we already know their strategies, we know their tactics, and we know how to get ahead of those problems.
I'm amazed that the most optimistic voice I think I've heard on this does come from Georgia. That strikes me. And I want to hear a little bit more about the preparation that all of you are doing ahead of the midterm, specifically for this new environment where we're seeing unprecedented requests for voter data, unprecedented investigations of local election administration, or unprecedented access to ballots, or requests to get access to voting machines. Secretary Simon, can you talk a little bit about the game planning, or how you're thinking about preparing for a scenario where every day it feels like some new unprecedented thing or something that we had never thought possible seems to be happening?
Right. Well, in our office, we have an all hazards approach when it comes to planning for election. That's every election, not just this one, which means we have to plan for all hazards, even the ones that may never materialize. So every year, we have to work with our local partners to plan for the power outage, to plan for the bomb threat, to plan for the weather event. This year, there's something new, though, in that pile of hazards, and that is the possibility that our own federal government will somehow, directly or indirectly, interfere with the election. Now, to be very clear, I'm not predicting that any more than I'm predicting we'll have a bomb threat, but we still have to plan for it, and we are. So secretaries of state are collaborating with attorneys general across the country on those issues. I know we are with our attorney general. We're literally gaming out various scenarios. Part of the problem here is we're shadowboxing in a way. We don't know when or if the blow is going to land, but we have to plan for all sorts of contingencies. Will there be a last-minute executive order? Will there be a seizure of equipment? Will there be, some other action in court? Will there be, on and on and on. The only limit is our imaginations. We're not getting caught up, I don't think, overly much in that kind of gaming out of these scenarios, but you'd expect us to, our constituents expect us to at least plan for those kinds of things. And we are. We're trying to think ahead about what could happen and what our response would be in a coordinated way.
One scenario I think that I get asked a lot about when I talk to voters is the idea of armed troops at polling places. This is something that allies of the president have mentioned as wanting either armed troops or immigration enforcement. Secretary Thomas, is this something you've heard as a concern from voters in your community? And is this something, I guess, how can you prepare for that scenario?
I'm going to take a broader approach to that question
Sure.
because I think it's important. Connecticut, believe it or not, is not a swing state. And I remember when the first executive order came out last year, when I was looking at the list of demands, if you will, I thought, oh, Connecticut already does a lot of these things. We only accept ballots up to 8 p.m. election day. We have all this voter roll maintenance. Like, we do a lot. We have a Republican and a Democrat in charge of every election in every town across the state. So there should be a correlation that, like, hey, Connecticut's great, like, you're good, we're gonna focus on someone else. But yet, people approach me in the street all the time. Grandmothers approach me concerned, and I say, what are you concerned about? And they say, I don't know, I just feel afraid, but that something might happen. Citizens approach me all the time because they look like someone who's been targeted as an undocumented American afraid of troops, ICE, etc. Women approach me on the street all the time. I'm nervous. Should I go out and get a passport? What's happening? Young people approach me all the time, just confused and fed up and a little anxious. So regardless of whether or not any of these things materialize, it is taking a toll on voters. And what I don't like is that this administration is making voters feel the way I used to feel before I got involved in politics, like a political pawn and not a person. And I think it is impacting voters greatly, and I feel that it's our job collectively to reassure them that no matter what happens, we have gamed it out and that we are prepared.
And I should also note, obviously, that armed forces at the polls is considered to be illegal. So that's just, I didn't mention that before, should note that.
Miles, can I just,
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
one piece of that thread? I get that a lot too, particularly ICE at the polling place, Border Patrol at the polling place, particularly because I'm from Minnesota and we just went through this in this last winter. So it's still a fresh wound where I'm from. And what I tell people, I remind people, is that in Minnesota and most states, remember, you don't have to go to a polling place at all. You can vote from home, from your kitchen table. So if that concerns you or someone you know or a community you're part of, remember, there are multiple ways to vote. You don't have to vote on election day. I mean, in Minnesota, and I gather most states, you can vote in person on election day, sure, but you can vote in person before election day, and you can vote from home by mail as well, and you don't have to run the gauntlet of law enforcement or anyone for that matter. So that's one potential workaround.
And that's part of the planning, right?
Yeah.
So we're all doing the same planning that Steve talked about, but part of the planning is education and talking about the federal law. And in Rhode Island, we actually passed law on top of the federal law to prevent federal agents from being at polling locations. But education is important because, as Stephanie said, the strategy is to sow doubt, strike fear, create an environment so that people are a little intimidated and may not vote. So education is really a part of the preparation beyond the hazards that Steve talked about.
Go
I
ahead.
would like to add to that, and kind of, I don't see my fellow media people in here. I'm sure you're in here somewhere, but the fear is coming from somewhere. And if you're constantly reporting on the fear and driving up the concern without fully explaining the process, you're doing a disservice to the voters of Georgia and nationally. And so I would really challenge all of you to take a deeper dive into elections. I'm sure the folks in here are doing that. There are those that, they're on tight deadlines, they're underfunded, whatever.
and they're not taking that deeper dive. But what a lot of voters really are asking for is they want to know the process. And it's really our job to explain the process, and it's the media's job to report on it. But I think they could do a better job.
Yeah, and I frankly get into a back and forth often with governments who feel like, oh, you're reporting on hypotheticals, or you're playing out the worst case scenario. Why are you focusing on that? But I wonder how you guys are thinking about this as people who are in charge of part of your job does feel like it should be instilling confidence in the process. Do you feel torn in terms of wanting to talk about this but not wanting to talk about it, or how are you thinking about communicating about some of these scenarios?
I think it's our job to explain with strength what the process is and kind of simmer some of this rhetoric down, because for the last, 10 years, we have been reactionary to claims of suppression and fraud. And at the end of the day, most voters trust how they vote. They go in, they spend about 5 seconds thinking about it, and they walk out, and then they hear all of this rhetoric. And so I think it's really our job at the end of the day to simmer that down, be apolitical, and in a very confident way explain what this process looks like. And one of the things that works against us is because of security and all the things that go into elections, it's very hard to explain that process in a 7-second soundbite. I do think that there needs to be some sort of task force that comes together, and we try to simplify the process so that we can all explain it quickly. So that's another thing that's working against us.
Secretary Simon, do you want to jump
Well,
in
I
there?
would just say that the way we put it in our office is the balance is, from time to time, it's appropriate to sound the alarm, but you don't want to be alarmist. And that's the balance we're trying to strike. Like, it would probably be disingenuous to say, in response to a question about possible federal interference, nothing to see here, that's just a fantasy. I don't think that's true. And I said, remember, I said directly or indirectly. So I don't want to, sow doubt either. I want to be honest about what could be coming, but I always add very quickly that I think some of these scenarios are unlikely, and that if they were to come to pass, we feel good about the laws and the tools and the partnership and the resolve that we have in Minnesota to overcome those challenges. So being honest about what we are or may be facing without being alarmist, overly alarmist, that's the balance. There's no right answer, but it's at least I'm naming what the challenge is.
One of the areas to me that feels like it is surrounded with a little bit of uncertainty right now is vote by mail, both with the ongoing litigation around the executive order and the USPS, and then also every day I wake up and check to see if SCOTUS is going to rule in the Watson case, which could greatly impact a number of states and how they accept mail ballots. Secretary Amore, can you talk a little bit about that in terms of how you're communicating to voters who might be confused by all of these changes that could be leading up all the way to Election Day, and then also what some of these, especially with the executive order, what some of these orders could potentially do to local election administration?
And these are the questions we get. And so in both the last presidential election cycle and this cycle, we have gone on a tour of the state, and it's Elections Explained. That's the title of the tour. And I think we've been to 20 locations over the course of those two election cycles and answer questions around just that. And most Rhode Islanders don't know that Rhode Island is a day of election state, right? It's a mail ballot state that's only accepted on the day of election at the close of the polls. But those questions are out there. As Stephanie mentioned, people asking about whether or not they should have a passport. I think we've had an impact traveling to these communities, and you get the local media coverage in these meetings, and we stay until the last question is asked, and all comers are welcome. And I think we've had an impact in explaining elections. I think Americans have had a primer on elections, and it's a good primer. People should know how elections work. I think no one was talking about Article 1, Section 4, and now people are talking about Article 1, Section 4. I don't know if anybody's read Hamilton 59 around Article 1, Section 4, but we should dig in and talk about this so that there's some comfort around the process. And I think we've been effective in doing that, but as it was pointed out, it's hard to do this in a few minutes.
I'm curious about, over the next couple months, it seems like there could be scenarios, and we see it actually every day still with what the president posts on Truth Social, where the federal government is actively contradicting state and local election officials. Georgia has dealt with this for a few years now in terms of language around the 2020 election, the security of the 2020 election. Do you have any thoughts on what works in terms of debunking misinformation? It does feel like we've been through this for years now. We should be better at it, but do you have any thoughts on successful tactics?
Well, I think we took the stance after 2020 and really at the lead up of 2020. People tend to conveniently forget that Stacey Abrams claimed that her election was stolen from her as well. And so our team was uniquely prepared to handle election disinformation because we had seen it from the left for all of 2019. And so debunking was relatively easy for us leading into 2020. So between me and Brad Raffensperger and Gabriel Sterling, I think we over-communicated, and we had hundreds of press conferences, hundreds of press releases. We constantly were in front of the media, and we took every interview we possibly could fit into our schedules. And so what worked for us was the over-communication. And it was pretty amazing, and I want to give credit to my team, Brian Germany, Gabriel Sterling, we all were singing off of the same song sheet. So it was when you have a big team like that, it's very hard to keep everybody on the same message, but it was easy to do because it was the fact. The facts were on our side at the end of the day. So what's effective is doing all the things that these people on stage have been doing, is communicating to their constituencies, drawing in the stakeholders to get involved into the election sphere, and recruiting the folks who are good actors but they just have questions, recruiting them into your offices, explaining the process, and most of the time you can flip those people to be voices in their community to talk about, hey, this is what's going on, this is how the voting machines work, this is the auditable paper ballot system. Because of the security around all of this, it's very hard to explain, right? But when people see it, they're like, oh, this is my vote is secure. So I know that there were also studies coming out of the Hoover Institute that showed that if you get folks to do a tour of your local election officials, that strengthened their opinion of the election process. I don't know how you shove 7 million people into a Fulton County office to get a tour, but would love to do that. But at the end of the day, it's all about communicating. You live in a 24-hour environment for the media, so getting answers quickly is key. And I think the state of Georgia has done a really good job of that.
And if I can add, I've taken a similar but slightly different approach in that I never got involved with the tit for tat, like they say this is happening, I'm going to prove it's not. I've never done that. I have put civic education first, and like Gregg mentioned, we do a lot of work going to people where they are, talking to any audience, answering any questions, but I also give a small civics quiz wherever I go. And for the last year, I tend to focus it around election process questions. Like I'll say something like, if the indoor temperature reaches 103 degrees, will your polling place close? And you'd be surprised, like everyone's like, yes, of course. And I'm like, of course not. Like, what are you thinking? But it really illustrates to the audiences how little they know about the process. And then I follow that up with, you're usually reading national news stories. So your first go-to is this even happening in Connecticut? And I've been surprised how just those little types of things have moved people's mindset more than I think if I if I gave them chapter and verse, here's what your registrar of voters is doing. I tell them to download the manual. If they want to read all 150 pages, they can.
I also, As we're talking about misinformation, it's hard for me not to think about the changes that have happened at CISA and DHS and how different this election cycle will look than 2020 and 2024, 2022. On the cybersecurity front, I want to ask about that specifically. How much does it matter that basically all the election security folks from before are no longer working there and working on these issues? Does that matter? Should people be concerned about the country's cybersecurity posture?
I think we've replaced the support, but it's at a cost. So the resources and time and effort to replace what was federal support, takes away from our team's ability to do other things and takes away from our budget, of course. But I'm confident in Rhode Island we are doing the things to make sure that we are prepared and we're testing systems and we're doing what we were doing before, just not with the aid and help of the federal government.
I am concerned. Connecticut also has stepped up to replace those services, but I'm not sure that's the case for every jurisdiction across America. And if Connecticut had not done that, I'm not sure what the outcome would be, because to ask a town of 15,000 to track what's happening in Iran and Russia seems a bridge too far.
I would add that I agree with Secretary Amore. I think the states, certainly ours, have done a good job of backfilling and doing some of the things that the federal government was doing. For example, penetration testing is something which, for those who don't know, is sort of white hat hacking. You invite a friend, an ally, to come in and try to poke around and find your vulnerabilities, and they would do that. It's an expensive process. They're not doing it, so now we're paying a vendor to do it. That's an example of something we can backfill. But as Secretary Thomas just said, some things we can't backfill. For example, by now in a typical election cycle, over the last several elections, and I want to say in particular the first Trump administration, which is what makes this particularly galling. They were great partners and allies on this front. By now in an election cycle, we would have had one, probably multiple intelligence briefings where we would have been apprised of what the threat environment is out there in cybersecurity and security in general. That's not something you can just get from a vendor. That's something that is pretty much irreplaceable. But I agree that on the rest of it, sort of the technical aspects, we've been able to, at our own expense, replace some of what they're doing.
I wonder, in terms of forecasting what we're going to see this midterm cycle, how much, I saw a lot of people watching what happened in California earlier this month and the sort of misinformation storm that centered on the vote counting in California. Any of you want to talk about, as you were watching that, did you see a blueprint or things that you thought about, oh, I should be prepared for X, Y, Z, watching that whole scenario unfold?
The only thing I keep going back to is California has known issues and they need to start cleaning it up. And they know that. And you know, I was talking to some election folks last night on some of those solutions and how their voter registration is set up and their DMV doesn't communicate with this data set or whatever. And it's like, y'all have all the money in the world to fix this and resolve these issues. They just need to be realistic and start executing on that and start fixing their problems. Otherwise, there are going to be people who take up the opportunity to spread disinformation. So you really, as a state or a county or a local official, you really need to have your processes down pat. Otherwise, there are going to be bad actors that highlight that problem and expand on it. And you can't control that. The only thing you can control is what you can control, right? So.
I mean, the lesson is, right, you can't leave a void there where people can fill with conspiracy theories. You know, we're not a postmark state like California. We are, like the majority of states, a gotta get there by that day state. But I can understand why these things spread if someone isn't meeting those accusations head on and explaining that, yes, it's excruciatingly slow in California. Here's why. You may not like that policy. I'm glad our state law is what it is, but this is their chosen law, and this explains in part, or mostly, why they're experiencing these delays. It isn't anyone rigging or fixing or stealing. It's just an outgrowth of their law.
One of the narratives that popped up during that week or so where this was really a hot button issue, something we heard a lot about in 2024, non-citizens voting in American elections. Secretary Simon, I want to stick with you because I know that your state has done work on this issue. Can you talk a little bit about what you all have found in terms of how prevalent this issue actually is in American elections?
The word I use to characterize Minnesota's situation is that the level of that in Minnesota is microscopic, truly microscopic. Out of millions and millions and millions of votes cast, it's a handful or two that we know of. Is it possible there could be more that we don't know of? Of course it is. But when you look at the actual studies that have been done, there was one particular study done by one of our law schools where a law professor did a top-to-bottom analysis looking at 10 years worth of voting in Minnesota. He found three examples that were provable, where the proof was there of a non-citizen having voted. And that's of, I think it was 13.3 million votes cast during that period. So 3 out of 13.3 million. That is tiny. That's 3 too many, of course. We all want it to be 0, but that is truly microscopic, and that's how we talk about it.
And we're seeing that play out with the states who have submitted their full voter lists to the systematic alien verification system. Those numbers are coming back, and they've been scrutinized by a number of media platforms. It looks like there's about a 14% failure rate, but the numbers are low to begin with. And so I think that's proof that this is not a problem. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. As Steve said, we find cases, usually they're administrative errors, that they're not intentional. But I think the more reporting we hear on the states that have submitted their full voter list for that scrutiny, as imperfect as it is, I think that proves the point that's been made time and time again, and was made in the video that introduced this panel, that it's really, really rare. We're looking for a solution to a problem that does not exist.
And when I think about, there's about a dozen states who have run their voter rolls through the SAFE program, and it always begs the question. There's much ado made about it, but I promise you, if there were all of these cases being found, they would be in the news, but they are not. It is less than microscopic, certainly in Connecticut. And what I hear from the election workforce, they are not interested in political sound bites. They are interested in better salaries. They are interested in more resources and not more unfunded mandates. They are interested in recruiting and training the next generation of election workers. So it angers us in Connecticut when all of this time and resources and attention are put on problems that the election community are not worried about, instead of investing on what would actually make the experience better for American citizens. It's a bit frustrating.
One other thing, I guess, just in terms of the buckets of things we're watching this midterm cycle, is this idea of local election offices being investigated or having to interact with federal law enforcement. Can any of you talk about, I guess, what preparations you can do with your locals to prepare for such scenarios, or what you've already done?
In Connecticut, the legislature passed a law this session that, at least at a basic level, would require them to be in touch with our Attorney General's office or our office, depending on the type of subpoena or request that they've received. Separate from that topic, one thing we've worked on over the last year is to give our locals media training. Most of them are like, I don't want to talk to the press at all. But over time, they have understood that if they are the best ones to communicate around the details of something. Would it be enough if, FBI agents came in with vests on and documents? I don't know. But we are trying in many different ways to prepare them.
I'm still focused on the last question that y'all had, but I think the answer is simple. It's just follow the process. You're going to follow the law. There's nothing to hide, and we saw that in Fulton County is they followed the process and followed the law. And but to go back to your previous conversation,
always.
Secretary Raffensperger in 2018 ran on making sure only American citizens vote in our elections. And when he took office, we had a series of conversations with people I'm not going to name, but to be respectful of them. And I kept asking them, so, how do we check? And there was a lot of resistance to even checking to see if non-citizens were on the voter rolls. And I think it's that resistance that has Republicans concerned. And so when voters have a concern, be open to just simply checking. And so we were one of the first Secretary of States to audit our voter rolls and look into to see if there were non-citizens on the voter. And we did find some. And that was widely reported. And I think that is a fair thing to do, is to simply relieve some pressure that when somebody goes out there and says, oh, there's non-citizens everywhere on the voter rolls, you can go, you know what, well, we checked. And actually, it's not enough to sway an election, but there were a few. So let's shore up that gap. And that's a pretty simple thing to do.
Do you all think that will be the leading sort of conspiracy theory du jour that we're all going to be talking about for the next 6 months as well, or is there something else that I'm missing?
Yeah, I think it will all play out. I think we're going to hear about mail ballots. We're going to hear about non-citizen voting. We're going to hear about machines. We're going to hear about it all. I think that's just the par for the course. I think that most people know that when they engage with their Department of Motor Vehicles, they present documentation, and we talk about this when we tour the state. And I ask the folks in the audience, what do you present? And they'll tell me a birth certificate, that they may perhaps a passport, their social security number, and then they're surprised to find out, we have a list of 96% plus of those data points, so that we're doing a check within the system that exists. And I think that is the case in the vast majority of states. And then, we talk about common sense. I don't know of a human being that would risk criminal prosecution and deportation for a single vote. It doesn't make any sense to me. And so I think when you talk to folks about that issue should be dismissed. I think the other issues are legitimate. There are questions about mail ballots that we have to explain, that we have to make sure that folks know exactly how the process works. And I think mail ballots will probably be the focus.
And just to something related to that, it's sort of an exclamation point to something that Jordan said, which I thought was great, was about, in essence, we shouldn't treat anyone who's a skeptic or anyone who asks tough questions as some sort of tinfoiled hat election denier. That's not fair. I think it's every citizen's right, maybe even obligation, to ask very tough questions of their government, including but not limited to every one of us on this stage. That's perfectly okay. You don't want it to lapse into threats, intimidation, and harassment, but simply asking tough questions is not a problem. So treat people who do that with respect, bring them in, offer to have them be a poll worker. I mean, anecdotally, I've heard from folks in our counties saying that they've done that. There have been people who have asked really tough questions, have been very skeptical. They have persuaded that person to become an election judge, and in the words of one election administrator that I know of in northern Minnesota, she said, after this particular person who had been showing up to county board meetings performed his service as an election worker, he in essence said afterwards, you know what, I got nothing. I got nothing. I now see all the checks and balances that are in place before, during, and after the election. I now see how truly difficult it would be to carry out some of the schemes that I've been hearing about. So I think we should treat people who are skeptical with the respect they deserve, answer their questions, and I think that's a formula for success.
Agreed.
You mentioned the kind of when it veers into too far, the things we were talking about before 2024 a lot, just the threats and harassment and physical security specifically, which was not something we really, at least I covered much in the few years beforehand covering elections. Is that still something that you all are focused on or thinking about leading into 2026? How much is physical security on your minds as election administrators?
I'm not worried about it in Connecticut playing out as secretary, but my locals are worried about it. And again, we all exist in this national news media. We started a poll worker program for college students over the last 2 years. And during the orientation before the 2025 election, which was a municipal election, one of the 19-year-olds said, "Oh, my mom asked me to ask, what are you doing to protect me while I'm working at the polls?" And I thought, wow, I mean, it's just out there, whether it exists or not. So we are doing things like de-escalation training with our election workforce, and doing other types of training to make them feel comfortable.
Many of our cities and towns have used some of the security grant money from HAVA to hire police officers for polling locations. It's up to them. And I think we focus more on physical security around elections equipment physical security and ballot physical security, just to make sure that that's where it should be, not only with us, but with our 39 cities and towns who are charged with taking care of that equipment. And those ballots to make sure that they're secure. So, you know, we've been fortunate. Our local elections officials have not been threatened. They've been harassed a little bit, but they've not been threatened.
We, in 2024, my brain keeps going back to this, but on election day, we had a number of bomb threats that were pretty strategic, and they were targeted to a certain type of county. And we knew early on that this was foreign influenced. And getting that message out, we got it out within 30 minutes, and but that didn't stop the polling place from being disrupted. So there are processes in place to make sure that voting continues, or that there are hours added to that precinct that was affected. And so I keep going back to, I really want to be careful on the rhetoric of this, because from what I can tell, the threats have been foreign in nature, at least in Georgia. And so I don't want to stir any kind of controversy to prevent turnout. And I think the media really has to thread that needle and be sophisticated on how they report it. And I don't have an answer on how to do that, but I really do hope that they are very careful with their messaging around this particular issue.
Talk about that idea a little bit in terms of, I mean, are you all concerned about how all of the different fears and dynamics that they could suppress turnout, especially among communities specifically who, I know I've reported a lot on how Latino communities, for instance, who are worried about ICE at the polling place, or I guess how all these narratives could potentially have a suppressive effect, even if they don't come to pass.
I'll say, just again, based on everyday conversations, I don't want to undersell the fear or the concern or the disgust, right? You don't have to be Hispanic to be fearful, and I think people are just fed up. And people are fed up with politics, partisanship, whether, like I always say, it doesn't matter what policy you have or policy desires you have, you need to put resources into educating the public, you need to put time into creating good regulations, time to train your election workforce. That's what people want to talk about. I find that most people are just like, I don't know what to think anymore, and that's what makes people back away. I feel a very different energy than I have felt sort of just out in 2018, in 2020, in 2022. Right now, and it could just be Connecticut, people just feel like they don't know what to think. And when they're busy, that means they won't think about voting at all.
Although turnout has been strong in special
other
elections
places.
and primary elections, and I think over the course of the history of the nation, whenever there's been suppression, real or imagined, people respond by showing up in larger numbers, and I think that's what we'll see.
What I try to do, whether it's someone worried about ICE at the polling place or anything else, is to acknowledge the anxiety, but then immediately describe what we would do or what we expect will be done, whether it's by us or someone else, to alleviate or at least address that concern. I think that's important. So the story is, in essence, or not the story, I think the situation is, you're not wrong to feel anxious about that thing, whatever it is, but we do have good laws in place and partnerships and the resolve that we've all discussed here, and I think it's going to be okay. I think that's because, as you say, we don't want to dampen turnout by just mentioning this stuff. That's the challenge.
We're going to turn it over to Q&A in just a second, but I wanted the last question. Something I've thought about now that I've covered a few election cycles is how the story does not always end up being the story we think it's going to be leading up to the election. The most notable example of any reporting I did pre-February 2020 was just absolutely threw in the garbage when the pandemic set in and everyone changed their voting processes and everything that went along with that. So I guess, do you all have any thoughts on things that maybe we aren't thinking about that you or your election officials are thinking about right now as midterms get closer?
Well, I would just say there are things we're thinking about, but I don't necessarily care to give a roadmap to those who might be thinking about doing those things, and that sort of comes back to the only limit is the limit on our imagination, right, in terms of trying to game out these systems. We don't want to be in fantasy land, but we also want to be hard-headed about what could plausibly come our way. So I can say, maybe unsatisfyingly, that yes, we're thinking about weird zigs and zags, but sort of keeping those to ourselves for now.
And I would say, we talked about it, I think misinformation is likely to be a bigger problem than we think. Sometimes it's disinformation, but more often than not, I find it's misinformation, where even reporters sometimes are reporting something that's not quite accurate for the jurisdiction or the
not
state.
me, right?
Not you, of course. Present company excluded. But it's just honest mistakes. So getting everyone up to speed on the particular jurisdiction they're covering, I think is really important, because the media could be a great partner in countering some of that misinformation. And we do a lot in Connecticut to meet with the media and brief them and give them all the detail they need. But my fear is that it may happen very quickly. And, most secretaries don't have a large advertising budget to counter.
I think the scrutiny has been good, and I know that's counterintuitive, but the scrutiny has been good because I think time and again, the system has held, and folks have learned more and more about the processes. I'm a big baseball fan. They put in the ABS system for balls and strikes, and we found out the umpires are really good. Right? They're really good. We now know that all those complaints, those imaginary complaints, were just that. That these professionals do their job really well, and elections officials are like umpires. You don't notice them if things are going well.
All right, well, I think we can leave it there. For Q&A, I'm sure you guys, all you smart people, have questions you can ask these folks. We've got microphones in the back, I think, and if everyone who has a question, if you could just say your name and who you're with or associated with, that'd be great.
We dazzled them. No.
Clearly, clearly. Who wants to get us started? I know people have questions.
We'll take answers, too.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Pam Smith from Verified Voting. Just because it came up, I should mention I'm from California, home of the long vote count. And tomorrow, California Voter Foundation is releasing a new report about California's long vote count, including a number of solutions that are proposed and actively being piloted. So there's an answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good.
We could ask you a question about the California. I mean, this has been going on forever, right? This is not new. It's drawn the attention of those who want people to pay attention to what a slow count looks like. But this has been the case throughout the history, and Republicans have been elected just as Democrats have through this slow count.
And we let you watch it.
There is a hand.
You can watch the count.
Right.
You could, it's like watching paint dry, but you can come and watch and assure yourself that it's totally fine.
I'll just add about the California count because a couple of things. I was out in California when they were counting the ballots, and I was talking to election officials out there. I don't know if many people realize. First of all, everyone realizes California is huge. It's absolutely massive, and there's a ton of votes. And their policy choices have led them to about where 90% of them are mail ballots. And they had hundreds and hundreds of thousands, probably millions of ballots returned on election day, which can't be pre-processed because the election officials don't have them yet. In the very first report out in California on election night, they reported out 5.1 million ballots on election night. That's as many as Georgia has ever reported out, basically. That was just their first report out on election night. The volume is humongous. And there's only 58 counties in California. So the volume in each county can be very, very large, particularly in some of those that you can see. I actually have a suspicion, and I'm just talking a little bit as you are all supposed to be coming up with questions, because how often do you get 4 people like this up on a stage ready to answer anything you have to ask? I suspect that for all of the criticism of California that occurred after election night, that if California had reported out all of its election results at 8:30 p.m. on election night, and certain people didn't like the results, they would have complained that California counted too fast and the fix was in. I think in many of these cases, and I look back at a lot of things you dealt with in Georgia, this is all about outcomes, and then they try to reverse engineer some kind of complaint about it because they just didn't like the outcome.
I think it was Charles Stewart that found that quick election results was the #1 way to basically dismantle the disinformation. So I will say that having those results quickly is key to pushing back on a lot of that stuff.
So I hear you about how big it is, but they also have more tax dollars, to pay people and to buy equipment to count votes. So they have more resources to count those votes. And so I know it's a totally different beast, but they have more tax dollars. And so all the other states, all the secretaries up on the stage and the deputy secretary, all these other states, we have less tax dollars, but it's sort of proportionate to our population and the number of votes that are cast. So I don't accept as much they're really big when they do have some tax dollars. And I think the other thing is I do think it was some opportunistic. Trump doesn't care. Republicans, we don't care about Spencer Pratt. He was just a useful tool. And if, on election night, he got his 25% like we knew he was going to get, because that's what you get when you're a Republican, it wouldn't have mattered. But I do think that they have tax dollars in California. They should use them to count their votes quicker. Just like the other states use their tax dollars to count the votes proportionally based upon their population. So I think to me that's one of the underreported parts of this, is that they just choose to not spend their tax dollars to speed up that count. I mean, there's policy changes they could certainly make, but they could spend their tax dollars more wisely. And that's been left out of this. And I think that's an important part of, you're bigger, you have more tax dollars. And we know they have a lot of tax dollars in California.
You mean a legislature and secretaries disagree?
Yeah.
I love you, Trey.
First of all, this is my board member, former Republican Secretary of State of Kentucky, Trey Grayson, who is fantastic. And as usual with Republicans, is talking about how you should take tax dollars and spend more of them. But I will point out, I mean, the biggest variable here, there are two biggest variables, and it has nothing to do with spending. One is, when do those last ballots come in? Actually, the late arriving ballots in California, I looked at the data, it's a very, very small percentage of the ballots. It was almost. But they were still getting those. They couldn't open those boxes. They didn't have them in hand until 8 p.m. I mean, the thing about California that I think is most interesting, and when I mention this to people, it always kind of raises eyebrows. The other biggest variable is the margin of victory. I mean, Georgia wasn't declared final in the 2020 presidential election until a couple days after the election. That wasn't because Georgia was counting slow. That was because the margin was narrow. And in California, think about, when do you learn who the media is calling California for president on election night? You learn it at 11:01 p.m. Eastern, 8:01 p.m. Pacific time. Why is that? Because the margin is huge. Congressional districts might take a lot longer because there are some very narrow margins. I think, to Trey's point, though, there are things California can do. I'm sure we're going to see this in this report. And there are absolutely things. Money is part of it. There's probably some other things they can do. And that's not, and to your point, Jordan, I think that's a really good, I mean, there's no reason not to try to improve and try to make it harder for the election deniers to try to undermine an election result. But, you know, it was kind of opportunistic, as you pointed out.
I want to jump really quickly on the competitive elections point for a question for these fine folks here. Is something I've been wondering about, because the correlation between close elections and misinformation, because the vote count takes a while, but also just because it's more, I think, claims about fraud are more likely to work when it's like, oh, 55 votes could have turned this election or something like that. Do you guys think about that in terms of knowing which elections are expected to be competitive or very close, and preparing for those scenarios more for those races, or for those local election officials? Or how does the competitiveness of the race play into your preparation?
I'm an outlier, I'll say it. I have said from day number one to expect election results on election night is ridiculous. No election has ever been certified in any state on election day. So I try to make that clear from the outset that no one should expect it. You want your officials to do their original counts, do their double checks. We have automatic recounts if the margin is too small, and wait for the certification, which happens to be 2 or 3 days later, depending on some things. But I'm an outlier.
Yeah, we prepare for the election cycle, not the contest. I think that plays out, and then you have to be front and center, as Stephanie said, and be willing to offer information, talk about what the law is, and make people feel comfortable with the fact that the process is ongoing.
Same approach. I think exactly as Gregg, we try not to let our amateur punditry seep into the administration of the election, although, as David Becker said, some of it is really outcome, based on the outcome. I mean, President Trump recently said he's convinced that he won Minnesota 3 times. He didn't. He lost Minnesota 3 times. And whether you like that result or not, that was the result. And so it does tend to hinge more on the outcome and less on how close it was.
The state of Georgia has been in play for quite some time, whether some folks want to live in that reality or not. And, we prepared the legislature, we prepared voters for the event of what we saw in 2020, that the state is in play and it could flip. And it didn't change or stop anybody from contesting their elections. So I think it's a little unrealistic to put all of that weight onto election officials. It really lands on the parties. And if your state flips, like Georgia's likely to flip, and you haven't fully prepared your voters for that, that's on you, party, not on the election officials.
I saw some hands, a lot of hands
There are
now.
quite a
People are awake.
He has them.
Oh, you got the mic. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if you got the mic.
It's yours.
I'm Pat Merlo, and my experience has been around the world working and helping people with trustworthy elections in 65 plus countries. And so what David was just saying about the closeness of the election, what you all have been saying about the margins and also what it takes for a count when a count's delayed, there's suspicion and so on. But what we're seeing in our country, and I've seen in so many other places around the world, is conditioning the environment in advance to expect that the election is going to be bad. And so coming back to you and the things that you've been doing that are proactive, forums and other kinds of education, I think is critically important. But you haven't addressed social media, AI, influencers. Are you making relationships with social influencers to get this information out in advance to help debunk or compare? I mean, I could drag it out, but I think you get what the question is. Thank you. Thank you for your work.
We try to do everything. We're on most social channels. We are in the process of, we have worked with content creators in the past, in the 2024 cycle. We're trying to expand that for this cycle. Because we have never had any type of outreach budget, we have been very intentional, like the old-fashioned way, going out and making relationships. Over the last 3 years, I would say we have built relationships with about 800 organizations and entities that we use to be our funnel for getting information from our office out to the grassroots. And we've started a number of civic programs, including our civically engaged organization program, CEO, for businesses and nonprofit entities, where we send them information every month and we ask them to share it with employees, our customers. So we very much believe we have to cover the entire spectrum, and we try to.
Yeah, we're on social media, and we release an informational video probably every week. But the problem is we're all connected to our own algorithms, and people are convinced. I don't know anybody that voted for that person. How could this be? How could the result be what it is when I have never met anybody who's even said anything remotely kind about that candidate? And that's tough to break through. That's really tough to break through. But we're there, and we're in the space doing our best to make sure we get some attention to the processes.
I think, unfortunately, there are some very influential people on social media who are just conflict entrepreneurs, right? And they have a vested interest in sustaining the conflict. So no amount of information is going to deter them from their mission. That's the problem. I'm not saying that's everyone, but there are some prominent ones who their bread and butter is stoking and perpetuating the conflict.
I'm pretty realistic as to, our abilities to fight disinformation online. You're fighting a machine that is well funded, where, the things that we talk about are really unsexy. They're very boring. Try to sit here and talk about audits for 30 minutes. Yet, they're to Trump's, right? I know. To Trump's credit, he made audits really interesting. So, we're up against something that I don't think there's a single solution, and we're not going to find it today. Sorry, guys. But there has got to be a third-party group out there that's interested in this that could fund something like that, and that would be wildly helpful. But adding one more thing to these guys' plate and mine, in an environment where you're fighting somebody who has 1 billion followers and we have 10, good luck to us. So.
Tina Barton. Secretary Thomas, you mentioned something earlier, and you and I have actually been in a room where we've had conversations around this, but when we look at retention of election officials and recruitment, you mentioned in Connecticut you're at 40% turnover. Curious as to the other states, what you're doing to retain the current election officials you have, to recruit new ones, and if the turnover rates that you're seeing are typical from one election cycle to another, or if you're seeing a spike, and how can we help keep the institutional knowledge and these election officials in their positions, and making sure that there's some longevity there and there's some passing on of that information and work habits?
Yeah, we're kind of seeing a natural turnover. retirement, moving on to a different profession or a different job within state or city government. But we really have not seen an exodus, at least during my time as Secretary of State. I'm encouraged by that. And again, I think our outreach and we're tiny. I mean, we can drive and go visit any of our elections officials within 40 minutes. So it's really an advantage for us to build those relationships and give that support in real time. And I think that's helped with a lack of turnover.
Well, in Minnesota, it's county-based, so we don't have a direct role in that. There was a spike in turnover, I guess you'd say, after the 2020 election, not only because of the intensity of it, but because it was administered during a once-in-a-century pandemic, and some people said, that's it, I'm out. But it's really stabilized since then in Minnesota. The thing that we can do to help ease those transitions is just be there as a partner, offer more and better services, make house calls, which we do across our state, and that we hope, has had an effect.
I'll add, since our last conversation about this topic, we're in the process of trying to create sort of like an election worker academy, if you will, to recruit people mainly who have signed up to be poll workers but want to get more involved. A lot of people don't think of it as a career choice. We are, as part of that, writing a good job description to give to the political parties. Our roles are elected, so often what the registrars have told me is like, oh, my town said I should run for this, that I'm good with details or something like that. And they didn't have a lot of information going into it. So we're trying to make sure people understand what the job looks like in 2026 versus 2006. It's very different. Connecticut has finally caught up to what some of you have been doing since the 1990s, which is early voting and universal absentee ballots. But that's a huge change in Connecticut, and people just aren't used to it. So.
I have the mic. Hi, I'm Shannon Green from Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement. We're a network of funders that are investing in renewing democracy through active civic participation, including in elections. So my question is about the role of philanthropy in civil society. So obviously foundations are investing in a wide range of civil society-led efforts, from get out the vote efforts to accompaniment to civic education to pre-bunking and debunking, litigation, networking and solidarity, and support to election officials and so on. My curiosity is around, when are those civil society efforts helpful to you? In other words, when do you find the most fruitful kinds of partnerships? And when are they actually detrimental or create more complications or challenges for you?
I feel like we need to go out for drinks or something. I'm going to jump in because civics is kind of my thing, and we've done a lot. What I find not helpful are organizations that link civics to politics and even elections. I think that is actually the problem. I think the more work we can do to talk about civics 365 days a year and talk about our obligations as citizens, et cetera, I think the better off we are. So many people who are fed up with politics say they don't want to be involved in civics, and they don't understand the difference. What's most helpful is also for us not focusing so much only on young people. A lot of programs focus K through 12 and even college. I have tried to focus on two things. Adults who never had that education, or in Connecticut, it's only a half credit requirement, which is not enough to prepare you for civic life. Trying to convince people that civic learning is lifelong education is really important. And I also try to focus on what I have dubbed civics you can use. Knowing the three branches of government, great, all the history. I'm like a Roger Sherman addict right now because of America 250. All of these great things are really important. But when you see that headline about something happening in your town or your family is having a hardship, that is not the time to try to figure out like how government works and where you can have some agency. So I wish more philanthropists were in those spaces as well.
First of all, I'm heartened that you're here. And I would say, and I say that because speaking of philanthropy, you know, it wasn't so long ago that Zuckerbucks was a four-letter word, right? And many people disparaged the involvement of foundations or philanthropy in anything related to elections, that it was coded as political somehow. I think that fever has broken, fortunately, in most of the country, it seems to me. So thank you. I think one of the things you can do is, that the philanthropic community can do, is back and fund really quality organizations. And at the risk of pandering, this is one of them. This is one of them. CEIR has been really a national treasure and really important to so many of us across the country. One of the I'd say the only downside generally is when we have a major philanthropic effort that bears on the work that we do on democracy and civics and that sort of engagement, and there's no communication. Like we don't have to offer our seal of approval. You can do anything you want, but we'd like to know if something's going on in our state rather than read about it or find out about it, in my personal experience.
Hello, everybody. Amy Gardner with the New York Times. I missed the top of this, so I apologize. I think you touched on it briefly, Steve, about the issue of late arriving ballots. Can you go a little deeper on that issue specifically as we wait for the Supreme Court to make its decision on that case? What each of you might think the impact of that decision could be if it's the broadest possible ruling making it illegal to allow late arriving ballots this election cycle across the country and not just in the state where that case originated. I think it's Louisiana. What is the impact of that going to be? And what are your concerns about how that's going to affect voter education and the jobs of election officials as we march towards November?
I'm maybe not the best person to ask since it wouldn't affect Minnesota. Our rule is that, and always has been, it has to be back by 5 o'clock on election day. So it has to be back by election day. So were that practice in Mississippi or California to go away, it wouldn't affect us directly. So I leave to others whose states
I guess
are
if it's a
affected.
broad interpretation, then the overseas and
Oh, I
military
see,
ballots
I
would
see.
be impacted.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
the
I see what
broadest
you're saying.
possible
Yeah.
interpretation would include Yokava, that's right.
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 And that is a concern. And it's late. It's late. To engage in an education effort that has an impact, it's really late. And the court should take that into consideration. Whether they will or not is another story, but they should take that into consideration because we have to have time as elections administrators to make sure the public is aware and that our folks are aware of that change. But I'm concerned about that.
Hi, over here. My name's Stephanie Liebergan. I'm a correspondent for Scripps News. Wanted to ask, you mentioned earlier concerns about mail-in ballots maybe being one of the biggest things to focus on this election cycle. Just earlier today, in testimony before Congress, they were talking about a new proposed rule from the USPS that they would not allow the USPS to deliver mail-in ballots, returned ballots, in states that have not turned over their voter rolls to the Trump administration. If a rule like that were to go in place, how do you as a state, how do you balance that concern for states that do have concerns about turning over their voter rolls, but then you also want to make sure that the Postal Service in your state can actually take ballots from the voters' homes to the election officials. How do you potentially deal with a rule like that?
Well, I will say I find it extremely problematic on a number of levels. First of all, we're 132, excuse me, from the general elections. So to be talking about standing up this kind of apparatus now, at this close date, is something that I think elections administrators everywhere are very, very nervous about. But even if this were to kick in 2028, hypothetically, it isn't, but even if it were, in a state like Minnesota, it's problematic for an additional reason, and I gather there are other states like us. We have no deadline in Minnesota for requesting a mail ballot, which means that it's up to everyone's individual judgment or risk tolerance, right? We don't advise someone 3 days before an election to order a mail ballot. That would not be a good idea, but someone could do that. It's all about risk tolerance. I mean, we say you should do it, weeks before. That is ordering the ballot to come to you, right? But because there's no deadline, I don't know, based on this rule, how at what intervals or when is the list due, right? And if it's due at a time that means Minnesotans might not be on the list yet, or maybe there's a supplemental provision of names, I mean, it's a real mess from the standpoint. So you can bet that when the comments to the proposed rule are due, those are some of the things that Minnesota and other states are going to be talking about.
And we should continue to talk about the idea that we're trying to create, that the administration is trying to create a national voter database through these regulation rules. And to Stephanie's point, civic education is really important. It's important that Americans understand that that's outside of the scope of the Constitution. Since I was born, we've expanded access to the ballot through congressional acts. We've never seen a chief executive or their agencies intervene like this in an attempt to change the voting process. And people should be aware of that. That's not partisan, that's just historical fact.
Lisa Danitz, consultant to Brennan Center. In as much as the panel today is called The Big Picture, the Federal-State Dynamic in Elections, I wonder if you could comment, and to the extent you've thought about it, articulate a vision, if you will, for post-2026, post-2028, of what you see as the best-case scenario for a federal-state dynamic in the context of elections. And I want to be clear, right? Like, we have to be realistic about how the operation of the federal executive branch has evolved. But if you could identify I'll call it the realistic best-case scenario for going forward, what would that be?
Sure, it's my belief, and I think the Constitution backs me up on it. Some lawyer will fact check me, but states run elections, and I believe that will continue. It's continuing as we speak. And what I really hope that we do is that we come together, our swing states, our normal state, Connecticut, everybody comes together and starts talking about kind of a standard set of processes so that we can communicate them really well. And it's not different in Georgia, it's not different here. Just something that is a standard that we can point to and say, okay, I know that these elections are secure because X, Y, and Z is standard nationally. And I don't think the federal government needs to be a part of that. I think the states can come together kind of like an ERIC and do that on their own.
And I think we saw that with HAVA. That was a congressional act, but that had broad bipartisan support, and we're all living under those rules and regulations today, and I think successfully.
And if I could create anything, you're saying we would see a civic revolution, if you will, where the American people are more educated about, like, maybe all these questions lead to a better educated electorate, and then we can start to see the federal government intervening in a way that the American people would like, which is, I believe the American people want more voter education. They want to understand how this works. They want to serve as poll workers and get involved. They want tight cybersecurity. They want they don't want like little counties trying to figure out how to navigate foreign threats. I think they want investment by the federal government in a way that makes sense to achieve economies of scale, et cetera. What they don't want is a national database being built by the federal government to be used for any purpose.
You mentioned vision. I think the vision I would have is to restore the partnership that we once had under Democratic and Republican administrations, including, especially, the first Trump administration. Not a partnership in administering elections, because as Jordan says, the Constitution is clear. States administer them. We're not asking for a partner to help us administer. We are asking for a partner and a partnership that would give us some of the tools that would help us better administer the elections. And that, unfortunately, has not been forthcoming this election cycle for the most part.
All right, with that, I'm going to close this panel and thank you so much to all of our panelists and good luck this year.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lyle.